Hey everybody, this is JJ Chalupnik here with another Mega Man Legends X update. Today I'd like to talk about the Mirumijee snake-like Reaver bot and the rig provided for that Reaver bot. I will provide this rig and model and textures all in the description of the video, so you can download them and mess around with them, but they will be, just like in the last one, they will be in Maya 2020 using the surface shader in Maya, the standard shader. And it will have all the textures and everything will be provided, but you will need Maya 2020 to run everything. It will be an ASCII format, so you should be able to bring the asset into a prior version of Maya, but you will need to probably reset up the shaders. And just to give you a little overview of what's going on here, here's our little Mirumijee. You can see I've just kind of posed him in his sort of idle search pose. Now, there were a lot of unique aspects to this particular character because he only has 4 segments, and because of that there's a lot of limitations in terms of how much flexibility you can get, and really pushing and pulling those poses to make sure that there's enough character there to sort of sell the idea. And we have a lot of different ideas on how to maybe push this further, but you know, for now it's kind of like, well, we got to get through at least the base of it, and then we can add on top of it. So at this point in time we're trying to just get the snakes working, get them animated correctly and looking around, and it has proven to be a bit challenging with only 4 segments here, which also means there's only basically 4 joints as well. So it has been an interesting challenge trying to get this thing working. Now this rig, unlike the Zakobon rig, actually has an FK-IK switch. So what you just saw is an FK rig, which means forward kinematics. And basically what that means is it works in a parent-child relationship, and essentially you end up with the chain and hierarchy will control what's down the chain. So the top of the head is free to look around. While you go to the body, it will move the head and everything below it. You go down the spine, it'll do the same thing, all the way to the tail, where it will move the entire object. And this is really useful for certain kinds of animation, things like throwing a ball, or maybe throwing a punch, or things like that, where you're exerting force and you need to have a lot of follow-through and pay a lot of attention to your key poses. I also have the main master controller, just like in the Zakobon, which will let you move everything around. Right here, using the master controller, you can go in here and I have these additional attributes that you can control certain parameters for this character. So in this case, I can switch from FK to IK because I'm already at a value of 10. I swap that down and you can see I've automatically set it up so that it hides the prior controllers and adds the new ones. Now, the reason why you'd want this is if you wanted to do something like walking or grabbing onto a surface or having a character leverage their weight on a surface. IK is extremely good for that, and this is basically a really common practice used in rigging and animation. Anybody who's done it before would probably recognize that term, but what it means is inverse kinematics, and it basically works from the ground up. So whereas forward kinematics will have a parent-child relationship, the inverse kinematics is basically the inverse of that, meaning it will grab, based off your chain, it will grab the child and it will navigate based off of an IK handle the remainder links in the chain, the remaining links in the chain. And it's not a perfect system for something like a snake, but it does give us some nice little extra animation, which is helpful when posing. But it also has limitations, because when you try to pose, you end up with extreme poses, or you end up with twisting and other issues with this, especially with this particular one, where it could be a bit cumbersome and not ideal. Now, as I mentioned before, when you make your rigs, you want to make sure you leave room for all of your translation rotation to be zeroed out, because when you do, you can snap back to its original pose, and that can be very, very helpful. And you can also see that I've got the tail kind of doing the same sort of operation, so you can kind of move around and gather poses and do what you need to do. And lastly, on this particular character, I've added a slither function. Now basically, because the spine is using a Spline IK system to manage each of these joints in the chain, and it's an IK spline, I can also drive that spline, which is essentially just a curve, with a deformer. And in this case, the deformer is a sine wave. So what I've done is, if I show you the curve, let's see, can I show you the curve? You can see the curve here, which is part of the controls in the do not touch section of the model. Basically, that curve is being driven by a sinusoidal wave. So if I change the amplitude and I adjust the wavelength, you can see when I'm in IK mode, I'm actually getting a translation of that. And if I animate the slither, you'll actually see a slither-like effect. Now, it does kind of require some balance. If you go too far, it ends up looking a little strange. So you do have to be very cautious about how much you push it, because obviously the more you push it, the more difficult it'll be. But what's really cool about it is if you just animate this one offset, you can actually achieve a pretty fun looking slither effect, and it just kind of works, which is pretty sweet. So if I just do this as just an example, you can kind of see I'm already getting a slithery effect. Now maybe I'll go a little bit lower so that the effect is a little bit easier to see. So you can kind of see what it's doing. And you can make it more or less aggressive depending on how your approach is and what you're going for. But you can also see how the behavior of the sine wave is controlling the curve, which is then controlling the joint chain. And this can be really powerful in terms of, you know, for this particular character to just kind of establish a slither and get something kind of, you know, simple but effective for a character with literally only 4 links that make up their entire body. I'm going to turn that off and you can see the slither. And that's generally speaking it for the rig. So just to summarize, the rig has several functions. It has an FK-IK switch and an amplitude control and a wavelength control, and all of this can be in a slither offset, and all of this can be done inside of the master controller. Because it's a spline based rig, you can control it with FK or IK. You can control these individual chains to get specific poses if you are in need of that. And that's about it in terms of the simplicity of this model. Now to talk about a little bit about the materials, just like I did with the Zakobon, you can see that in this particular character, I'm using the same shader setup with the same kind of layout. I've basically built myself a preset for these so that it's easy to look at and understand. And I've got essentially a PBR workflow at the moment with some added emissive, and this kind of adds a layer of brightness to everything and sort of lifts everything up. So I've got 2 layered textures, and these layered textures have the ambient occlusion and color piped in, as well as the emissive. The emissive is like the eye or any other glowy bits that you might want to put on your characters. And then you have the normal map, which is piped into a bump 2D, which is piped into the normal camera, and a roughness map, which basically determines how shiny and reflective with like mirror-like reflections or really dull, rough reflections on the surface of the object. And lastly, I can show you how Mega Man is sort of stacks up against this character. Once again, scale is incredibly important when you're building characters or any asset, really. You always want to make sure you're working in the proper scale, so I've brought in this Mega Man as a reference to make sure that I'm getting the rough scale correctly, and I've measured this again with several videos and reference and anything I could find to sort of get the idea of roughly where it's at and what feels good as far as a Reaverbot character against Mega Man. One last thing worth mentioning with this character and every character is that I use a quick select set to get this out of Maya and into Unreal. So if you see, I've got a joint chain with a root joint. Not all of them have that, but this I've started to implement that as just a point of good practice. And essentially what I can do is you go up to Select, Quick Select Sets, Mirumijee UE4 Bind Set, and that will grab the mesh geometry as well as the bind joint chain, which is basically the joint chain that is actually physically bound to the mesh, and it has the skin cluster on it. And from here you can go to File, Export Selection, and you could basically change this to an FBX. And once you're in FBX, I would recommend putting it inside a UE4 publish folder that you can then add to characters or something like that. And be sure always, if you're exporting animation, you need to make sure you're baking the animation with the proper timeline amount for each animation so that it comes in properly in Unreal. And if you need a skeletal mesh or anything like that in Unreal, you need to have this deform models checked to make sure that it grabs the skins and blend shapes of your objects so that it knows how your weight painting is working and all that good stuff. If you do all that correctly, it should translate perfectly right into Unreal, and that's always a good thing. And well, that's pretty much it. Thank you everybody for watching this video, and if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the thread below. Also like, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. It's greatly appreciated. It helps spread the awareness of this project and the channel, so I greatly appreciate that. I hope you all are doing well. Have a great day, and thanks for your support.